Welcome. You're listening to Latin Waves with your hosts Sylvia and Stuart Richardson. Latin Waves is more than just hot rhythms. This is a show about community, about creating a culture that is inclusive and based on fairness. Because everyone deserves dignity, respect, and has something to contribute. A new world is possible, and it all starts with us. I'm delighted to be joined by prolific author Yves Engler. He's published 11 books and is also an active journalist who is constantly creating and being published in many mediums. One of the things that seems ironic to people when I travel is that Canada's PR, their public image is that of peacemaker. And when you think about Canada being an arms manufacturer, Canada being allied in the States in promoting war or promoting expansion of NATO in areas that clearly will arise conflict, seems counterintuitive. I only have to look at Canada's history with its own treatment of its own people, of its Indigenous people, and I know that Canada has, it's an empire building project. So can you talk a little bit about not only our history, but why it is important for us to decolonize the way we understand this project of, national government that was literally created for corporate benefit, not for the people?
There's a pretty clear line between understanding Canadian promotion of empire around the world today and over the past, sort of 150 years since the formal founding of Canada, and the project of British expansion and conquest of Turtle Island. In my most recent book on the history of the Canadian military, I basically show how the Canadian military is just its roots are the force that conquered these lands from Indigenous people. And, that was often very brutal. And of course, there's a lot of discussion about decolonization and reconciliation. And, there's some steps that go in the right direction. But overwhelmingly, the whole colonial process is continuing along. And, real questions of land back and really, genuinely reversing the colonial process are left aside, and when the pipeline companies and the fossil fuel companies have some territory that they see a lot of money to be made from, the question of Indigenous rights gets very quickly thrust aside. So that's part of certainly the history and understanding Canadian foreign policy, understanding how Canada's right at the center of the imperial core. Things like the Five Eyes intelligence apparatus. That recently Canada banned Huawei, the Chinese technology company, from the 5G and the 4G of Canadian internet. The basis why we have to ban Huawei is because our Five Eyes allies are fearful that this Chinese company will enable spying or espionage on Canadian internet and other entities, but in fact it's actually the other way around, where basically they don't want this Chinese company because it'd be less likely to follow the Five Eyes rules on spying. But the broader point that I'm trying to mention is that the Five Eyes, what is it? It's New Zealand, the UK, Australia, and the US. Well, what connects those five countries? It's not language. There's many more Indians or Nigerians that speak English. It's not geography. What connects them is that it's Mother England with the four other European settler states. And so we see right up until today, when we talk about anti-racism and stuff like that, right until today, it's open that our like basis, an important basis of our foreign policy, is this settler intelligence apparatus. And the reason we have to get in greater conflict with China is because we have to be working with our Five Eye allies. So it's really the depths to which Canada continues to be rooted, despite all the sort of rhetoric and around reconciliation, continues to be rooted in a Eurocentric, colonial ideology and alliances is significant. So those are some of the elements that we need to challenge while pushing for a less damaging Canadian foreign policy.
Yeah. The invasion in Ukraine has been tragic for the people of Ukraine. Early in the conflict, the Ukraine seemed ready to negotiate a peace agreement, but the U.S. quickly intervened, and we hear now Biden say there will be no concessions. We cannot tolerate concessions. Can you talk a little bit about the specific importance of this area for the U.S.? Why are they so embedded in sending billions of dollars in weaponry in Canada? We know Canada is invested because they like selling weapons, and we have a weapons industry here. But why is the state so embedded, in fighting Russia through Ukraine?
Well, I think that the U.S. empire wants world domination. I think that's pretty straightforward, pretty clear. And Russia is a country that's not subordinate. It's a country that's fairly powerful, not subordinate, unlike a country like Germany, which is fairly powerful, or maybe a country like Japan, which are also serious economic powerhouses. Those countries, their geopolitical outlook and is completely subordinate to Washington's, to NATO, Washington. Russia is not like that. So in that sense, Russia is this big country, 150 million people, as viewed as having a fairly effective military. There's question marks about that now. So from the standpoint of Washington, weakening any state that is not, subservient to the U.S. is something they want to do. It's, from the logic of state, you want to weaken competitors if you can, and especially if it's a fairly limited cost to you. And in the case of this war, this proxy war, the costs are primarily, while there is costs to Canadian taxpayers, American taxpayers, the costs overwhelmingly are, of course, the Ukrainians. But ultimately, from the standpoint of state domination, that's relatively low costs. So if they can get Ukrainians to weaken Russia, that just makes sense. At the more maximalist, there are American officials have raised the specter of ousting Vladimir Putin and sort of regime change, and then there's other clearly a line of American planners would like the idea of actually breaking up the Russian Federation and going to that extent. So there are. I'm not saying that people believe that that's a realistic scenario in the short term, but that is kind of the thinking of some elements of the American establishment. So again, you combine the geostrategic question of just wanting to weaken Russia, alongside the fact that there's a whole bunch of arms firms that see this as serving their self-interests, combined with, let's be clear, that Ukraine and Ukrainians, there's a whole faction of Ukrainians that see in this as, and I think correctly, as the sort of creating Ukrainian nationalism, right, and stoking Ukrainian nationalism. Nationalisms generally are developed in competition with other nationalisms. So, if Russia invades, and that stokes Ukrainian nationalism, and so there's factions of Ukrainian political life that view this sort of stoking of nationalism as this great awakening of the Ukrainian nationalist mentality. So that these are some of the forces that Canada has been supporting going back to the Soviet times within the Ukraine. And if you look at the roots of that, that goes back to the neo-Nazis that in Ukraine that supported, who killed tens and tens of thousands of Poles and Jews during World War II. There are a series of different forces that are coming together that help explain this. And I think we should also be clear, like within Russia, Russia is a country that spends 4% of its GDP on the military. It has a history of imperialism. Russians, view themselves. There's a whole imperial ideology within Russia. So there's also, forces within Russia that like, warfare and share that type of ideology. From the standpoint of, I think, Ukrainians most obviously, but also the world more generally, these are ideologies and that we need to reject to deal, again, to go back to it, but to deal with things like the climate crisis, but also just to avoid warfare. And this war still has the possibility of escalating into something even worse. As bad as it is, it could get escalated to something even worse. And the two main nuclear powers are involved in this, and it's not inconceivable to imagine other countries getting more directly involved and leading to something even more devastating than it already is.
I remember the war in Iraq united so many people worldwide against the war. It was a preemptive war. They were preempting what Iraq might do, right? We later found out that was, all their so-called evidence was made up. In any case, the invasion took place, and perhaps many people have forgotten about the thousands and thousands of people that died. But the devastation continues. And likewise, Afghanistan was subdued by war and terror at the U.S. for over 20 years. And then they now left. I guess what I'm trying to ask is, how has this history informed the level of violence that we are now witnessing? How is it different from that overt war, and yet perhaps even more damaging?
People say, I myself have been in debates and these different panels with people who are basically, supporters of Canadian foreign policy, and they'll complain that you're drawing moral equivalency between what the U.S. has done and what Russia's done. When they say that, they mean that what Russia's done is way worse. In fact, if you look at Iraq in 2003, by any measure, what the U.S. did is far worse than what Russia's doing in Ukraine, be it from the standpoint of the illegality, contravention of the UN Charter, be it at the level of geography and the whole question of unprovoked. So they repeatedly say that Russia's invasion is unprovoked. But if you compare the U.S. invasion of Iraq to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, it's far more stronger case to be made that Russia's invasion was provoked by U.S., Canadian, and other countries' policies. Yet Chomsky did a search in Google of how many mentions there are of unprovoked war in Iraq versus unprovoked war in Ukraine, and he found something like 2 million mentions around Ukraine and 10,000 mentions around Iraq. People elsewhere, and certainly people in Russia, and I say elsewhere, I mean outside of the sort of NATO countries, they this whole moral kind of, what's happening in Ukraine is so unique and horrible. It's laughable, because the reality is that even right now, if you look last 7 years, what the Saudis with Canadian weapons and effective diplomatic support have done in Yemen is worse than what's happening in Ukraine. Now, what I think is different is that the sort of geopolitical stakes of what's going on in Ukraine are greater, in large part because we are talking about the two main nuclear powers. As the history of warfare tells us, is that no one may have planned to escalate to a certain point, but the dynamics of conflict engender situations that become very difficult to back away from once you get down that path. And so that's always the danger of things spiraling out of control beyond what even the Biden administration may have wanted, or what Putin may have wanted from the get-go. And so that has to be taken very seriously, and that's part of why I think that we're correct in devoting significant attention to Ukraine, maybe in ways that are different than other conflicts, because the geopolitical stakes and the consequences are potentially that much greater. But basically the basic underlying, and that's just where this business about Western officials saying you can't just redraw borders by force of arms. Well, we're supporting our ally Israel, that's annexed the Golan Heights from Syria, that's stolen Palestinian land. If you look at 1999 and the breaking up of the former Yugoslavia was done in large part by force of arms, including a NATO bombing. The moral righteousness and these sort of high-minded comments from Western officials are just sort of transparently hypocritical. Again, that doesn't in any way justify what Russia is doing. I think what Russia is doing is illegal and is brutal, but there's been lots of illegal and brutal policies pursued by Washington and Ottawa.
You listen to Latin Ways. To support our work, please visit latinwaysmedia.com and consider becoming a member for as little as $1 per month. Thank you for listening. Including what they did with Indigenous people last year in the U.S. and what Canada is doing here and with Wet'suwet'en territory, against the Indigenous people. So, yeah. It's not just hypocritical, but it's the impunity which with all this death have been caused. More than 400,000 people have died in Yemen in the last 7 years by U.S. and, allies sponsor weapons in that war, and Palestinians have lost 90% of their lands, and at least 13 children were killed this year so far. So, the cost of war is always bear by the people. As the poet Gallant said, apathy is not a luxury we can afford. So we must engage, and we must continue to seek the truth and to unite and organize ourselves, because that's the only way we're going to change it. I mean, leaders have proven to be in the service of corporate interests, whether it be the arm industry or whether it be the agribusiness, the pharmaceuticals, whatever it is. They're not serving our interests. I wonder if you could talk about what are some of the ways that you keep yourself energized, inspired, and moving towards a path that can lead us to reconciliation, a path that can truly lead us to a world with peace.
We see positive developments and negative developments all around us. I mean, if you look at the struggle against homophobia in my lifetime, I've seen incredible advances in the last couple of decades. And if you look at struggles against racism, you see major victories in North America in recent decades. Those didn't just fall from the sky. Those because people struggled and people made those gains. And so I think that those victories are possible. I mean, on international issues, if you look at the question of Palestine, as horrible as what Israel's doing to Palestinians, you'll see a major sea change among Canadian public opinion on the question. I published a book in 2010 called "Canada and Israel Building Apartheid," and I was told by journalists at the time I couldn't even review the book because the word apartheid was in the title. Now you have in the last 18 months or so, you have Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, UN Special Rapporteur, the B'Tselem, they've all published reports detailing Israel's role in committing the crime of apartheid. So those academics and those human rights groups didn't just do that because they one day said, "Oh, Israel's committing apartheid." I mean, that's been clear for a long time. It's because of the activism that had been building, and then once Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International, which are mainstream organizations. Once they publish those reports, then you have the NDP foreign affairs critic raising the question in the House of Commons. You have more and more MPs, including Liberal MP just a couple of days ago, raising the question of apartheid. So this is how change happens, is through people campaigning, often obscured. They don't end up getting recognition. Unfortunately, that's one of the powerful ways in which our political system maintains itself, is that it denies the importance of activism and having made so many gains over the years, and sort of just like as if one day these politicians just realize this is the right thing to do, rather than decades, often, or certainly years, but usually decades of volunteers campaigning on issues. So I think that's the reality of social change, and I draw inspiration from that. And of course, we have to also be really clear. I mean, as demoralizing as certain things can be, and that I see going on in the world, these struggles in Canada are this is very easy compared to the history, right? Yeah, yes, it's to be demoralized by corporations continuing to win, and arms companies continuing to win is demoralizing. But it's nothing compared to the history of those who let's say the Haitian Revolution, where they people were brutalized and murdered in the most horrific ways when they rose up against enslavement. We live in a relatively, very propagandized, but a relatively free society in terms of, what the direct costs. We're probably not going to get murdered by the state or beaten by the police for challenging politicians, or So I think we have to be use that space that we do have. Yeah, and so I think the inspiration is from the fact that, yes, activists win. They have won, and they continue to win, and also to be sort of clear-eyed in terms of what the real costs are. Yes, there are costs. Yes, activists get marginalized by the mainstream power structures. Yes, you usually lose in the short term. Whenever you're fighting power, you're invariably, almost by definition, you're going to mostly lose in the short term. But if you look at the long picture, that's precisely what makes for better society and less damaging economic and political systems.
I love you. Thank you. And thank you for all your books that are amazing. In addition to all the books you write, you've also take so much time to give. And I am particularly excited about your Canadian Foreign Policy Hour. Can you talk a little bit about this? How did it start, and how can people join you?
Yeah, basically it's a new weekly hour-long program Zoom session on developments in Canadian foreign policy. We've done 3 sessions. It's people can find out about it on my website, yvesengler.ca, and it basically just comes out of a book club that I did for my book on the Canadian military, Stand on God's Whom, People's History of the Canadian Military, and we did 4 sessions of a book club, and then people wanted to continue on with having these sessions, so I decided to actually formalize it and open it up to a broader public. And the first 3 sessions have been quite good, and people can check that out on my they're uploaded on my YouTube channel. And yeah, I invite people to join, and also my articles are all appear on my website, yvesengler.ca, if people want to check that out as well.
Thank you again for all your work, and thank you for that injection of hope and energizing, active hope, really, because, hope is not something that we dream about. Hope is something we create by our daily acting and activism. Thank you again for being with us.
Thank you, Sylvia.
Take care. We're going to end the show with a song by David Rovics, We Are Everywhere. This is Sylvia Richardson. Thank you for listening.
When I say the hungry should have food, I speak for many. when I say no one should have 7 homes, while some don't have any. Though I may find myself stranded in some strange place with naught but a vapid stare, I remember the world and I know we are everywhere. And I say the time for the rich, it will come. Let me count the ways, victories or hints of the future. Havana, Caracas, Chiapas, Buenos Aires. How many people are wanting and waiting and fighting for their share? They hide in their ivory towers, but we are everywhere. Religions and prisons and races, borders and nations, FBI agents and congressmen and corporate radio stations. They try to keep us apart, but we find each other, and the rulers are always aware that they're a tiny minority, and we are everywhere. With every bomb that they drop, every home they destroy, every land they invade, comes a new generation from under the rubble saying, we are not afraid. They will pretend we are few, but with each child that a billion mothers bear, comes the next demonstration that we are everywhere. We are everywhere. We are everywhere.
Thank you for listening to Latin Waves. Latin Waves is an independently produced syndicated radio program made available for free to campus and community radios, and also to the world at latinwavesmedia.com. Please visit the website to hear previous shows, hear about upcoming events, and consider becoming a member for as little as $1 per month.